Welcome back to another AP World History National Review video lecture. This one is going to be on period 5, which is about the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution is really important overall to world history. Why? Because we see a change in basically the use of energy from what we call the old biological regime to what is known as the use of fossil fuels. And the fossil fuels really are going to change a whole lot of things we do within societies. For one thing, there's a huge demographic movement. People are going to be doing what's called urbanization, moving from farming areas into urban centers. Another huge change is the social relationships. There's going to be a lot of movement on the social hierarchy upwards. So people are going to see actually a reduction in social inequalities with an end to feudalism. But at the same time, there are massive growing economic inequalities. And so what we're going to see is a concentration of wealth amongst people and growing inequalities on the economic scale, which eventually is going to lead to a reaction of workers' movements. So what is my thesis in this particular case? My thesis is that the Industrial Revolution really did allow for massive positive growth in mass production, but we also saw a negative growth in economic inequalities and pollution to the local environment. Okay, let's start off with the change to ideas during this time. There's a challenge to the old beliefs, especially of feudalism. This first comes by the Protestant Reformation. Now, let's be careful here. The Protestant Reformation really was not a challenge to religious authority. It was a challenge to centralized Catholic authority, or what we call clericalism. After that, and the big thing about that too, was a belief that people could go directly to the Bible on an individual basis and interpret the Bible for themselves. The second major movement was known as the Enlightenment. There, one of the best examples is a man named René Descartes. He basically said, look, we should doubt everything. And then once we get rid of all of the things that we doubt, we come down to one thing. How did we doubt? Well, we did that through our thinking. And that allows us to be rational, to challenge things as individuals, and to doubt old wisdom. Last off is the Scientific Revolution. The Scientific Revolution, a good example that Isaac Newton said, look, if you really want to find out the truth, let's go to empiricism. What's that? Empiricism is using our senses to find out if something's true. You know, if I want to find out that there's a table in front of me, if it's really a table, it's really simple. I just touch it, right? Or I can smell it, or I can see it. In other words, I use my senses to find out what's true. And when we do that, if we put things under a microscope, maybe we can figure out what the laws of nature are in order to manipulate those. Okay, let's take a look now at the reasons for the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution takes place during this time of challenges to authority, and it takes place in Great Britain first. Why? Because they find a massive amount of coal there, and they realize they can use that to light fires at a much hotter temperature and get things moving. At the exact same time, it just happened that people were being kicked off of farming lands in a movement called the Enclosure Movement. This is where basically large landowners kicked people off of the land in order to mass produce crops on their land. This is known as the Enclosure Movement. As people started moving into cities, it led to a factory system. There we saw people moving away from the cottage system. So what's the cottage system? That was where people would make things individually, like in a farm somewhere. You'd go and you'd basically invest in somebody making a sweater. It would take them all month to make the sweater. But in the factory system, you could have 300 workers using a sewing machine inside of a factory in just one room. They could basically make 300 sweaters, not even in an hour, maybe like in 20 minutes. There were new technologies at this time, like the spinning jenny, which allowed things to move much quicker in making cloth and textiles. Railroads, like the George Stephenson Railroad, that moved coal and workers and resources down into factory cities pretty quickly. And the overall purpose here was mass production. All of this allowed for a new middle class to arise, which changed and ended feudalism. So what were the effects of this Industrial Revolution? Well, for one, there was a rise in absolute living standards. This was a good thing. As people moved from farming cities into cities, what you saw was that process of urbanization. Whenever people move from farming areas into cities, or urbanization, you're going to see a rise overall in absolute wages. However, at the same time, there were growing inequalities. Sure, people were making more money than were out in the farms in an absolute way, but compared to a lot of other people in the cities, they were not making enough money to really improve their lives at any huge rate. Now, the government at this time ran under a principle called laissez-faire, meaning we don't get involved. And because of that, you saw some pretty horrible things happening. For example, men at this time worked 17 to 19 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they made $6 overall for the entire week. Women made half of that. Children made $1.50. You saw children oftentimes working in coal mines where they got black lung, and you saw unsafe working conditions. So because of that, there were some reactions. The biggest reaction amongst most workers was known as the union movement. That's where workers would join together and collectively bargain for better living wages, better hours, better working conditions. But there were also radical movements like Marxism, that called for a violent revolution where classes would come together, especially economic poorer classes, and they would rebel and form a perfect utopian society. Socialism, they'd called for a way for the government to get involved and narrow the gap between the rich and the poor through programs. And anarchism, the belief that we should return back to farming itself, maybe live in smaller communities. There was also the development of what was called social Darwinism. Its best example was Herbert Spencer. He believed in something called eugenics. What was that? It was the belief that people over time had inherited certain genetic traits. Some were superior, some were inferior. And in the competition, naturally over time, certain races rose to the top while others fell behind. Okay, what are our takeaways from this time period of the Industrial Revolution? First off, number one, new ideas challenged centralized power in old ideas. The new ideas were rationalism, empiricism, and individualism. Number two, the new factory and industrial system challenged agricultural feudal relations in favor of a more competitive and urban industrial system. And number three, this new urban and factory system created massive inequalities that led to union movements, radical movements, and a questioning of the social hierarchy. Industrial Revolution really changed a lot of things, not just economics. It changed social relationships and political relationships. We're going to have to dive deeper into that and make some connections to what happens next during the age of imperialism. See you guys in class.